Naomi's fingers curled with iron certainty around Park Taeho's silk tie, wrenching the syndicate head downward until his sharp gaze was forced to lock onto hers. "Don't look back," she breathed, the words a ghost of a sound against his ear. "There is a sniper keyed on your heart. Your right hand just signaled the kill." The air between them turned electric, a collision of her calm intensity and his restrained, predatory shock. "Look like you're falling in love with me," she commanded, her voice a chilling blade. "Or you're dead in 3 seconds." Taeho's hand instinctively gripped the back of her neck, pulling her closer just as the reinforced glass behind his head erupted into a million diamond-sharp shards. It was a Tuesday evening in the Dragon Head estate, and the foyer smelled of polished marble and the antiseptic scent of power so absolute it had no need for noise. It was the kind of smell that followed men like Taeho, men who moved as if gravity itself bowed to their presence, carrying violence with the same casual precision as their bespoke suits. Naomi had stood by the heavy mahogany doors for 3 years, a shadow in a white headband and a black and white uniform, shivering only from the coldness that radiated off the men she served. Please like and subscribe as you follow the story. Taeho had paused just seconds before, his profile a sharp edge of genetics and ruthless bone structure against the warm gold light of the interior. He carried himself with an absolute stillness that made even the smallest movement seem unnecessary. He was a man whose name made others lower their voices, a man who rarely acknowledged the domestic staff who smoothed his path and polished his floors. But Naomi had learned the art of being invisible. She had learned to read the micro-expressions that telegraphed a shift in the air, the subtle difference between power that was inherited and power that was maintained with blood. That was when she saw it through the glass partition. The right-hand man, Taeho's most trusted advisor, was standing in the reflection of the rain-slicked courtyard. Naomi had tracked his movements for months. She knew he was left-handed because her own father had been, and she'd learned young to watch the hand that would swing first. But in that microscopic moment, the advisor reached up to check his watch with his right hand. It wasn't a glance at the time, it was a choreographed signal. Then, the flash, a glint of red light dancing across his platinum cufflinks, the confirmation signal for a sniper waiting in the darkness. In approximately 3 seconds, a high-caliber round would occupy the space where Park Taeho's head currently rested. The glass was reinforced, but not bulletproof. It would only slow the inevitable. Naomi didn't think. She reacted, transforming from a ghost in the house to the only thing standing between the dragon head and his grave. The silence following the explosion was more violent than the sound of the glass itself. In the grand foyer of the Dragon Head estate, the air was a thick soup of dust, sulfur, and the dying echoes of the alarm system Naomi had triggered with a hidden kick to the floor molding. Park Taeho remained pinned against her, his fingers still dug into the nape of her neck, his body a rigid pillar of shock and lethal instinct. For 3 years, Naomi Carter had been a ghost in this house, a flickering shadow in a black and white uniform who moved through the hallways with the silent efficiency of a clockwork toy. She was the woman who knew exactly how many grains of sugar Taeho took in his morning tea and which floorboards groaned under the weight of a heavy footstep. To the syndicate, she was a non-entity, a piece of domestic furniture designed to be looked through rather than at. But Naomi saw everything. She had cultivated the art of being invisible into a survival science, her hypervigilance a gift from a childhood where tracking a man's mood was the only way to avoid his fist. She didn't just clean the rooms, she read the debris of their lives. She noticed the microscopic tremor in the right-hand man's jaw during the Tuesday briefing. She saw the way the security detail's eyes shifted toward the exit 10 seconds before Taeho even entered the room. She understood the micro-expressions of betrayal long before the traitor himself had mustered the courage to act. Now, as the smoke curled around them, Taeho's gaze finally focused on her. It was the first time in 1,000 days that he was truly seeing her, and the look in his eyes was a terrifying mixture of predatory suspicion and raw realization. He looked down at her hand, still clutching his tie, the silk bunched and ruined in her fist, and then back at the shattered remains of the partition where his skull should have been. The power dynamic had shifted in the heartbeat it took for a bullet to travel. The man who owned the city was being held upright by the woman who polished his shoes. "You," he rasped, his voice a low vibration that Naomi felt in her own chest. Outside, the screech of tires and the distant shouts of a compromised security team signaled that the hunter had become the hunted. Naomi didn't flinch. She released his tie, smoothing the ruined silk with a practiced, ghostly touch that mocked her former servitude. The mask of the house maid was cracked, and beneath it lay a woman who had spent a lifetime learning how to survive men like him. Park Tae-ho moved through the wreckage of the foyer with the predatory grace of a man who viewed the world as a series of targets and assets. As the smoke from the sniper's round thinned, the true weight of his world, the Dragonhead Syndicate, settled over the room like a cold shroud. He was 36, a man of absolute stillness who treated noise as a threat and weakness as a terminal illness. To those who watched from the safety of the sidewalks, he was a legend of genetics and bespoke tailoring. To those who worked within his shadow, he was a force of gravity that bent the morality of the city to fit his own design. He ruled through a calculated blend of inherited power and blood-maintained fear, moving through life with a jaw sharp enough to cut glass and eyes that reflected light without ever truly absorbing it. Naomi watched him from her place in the corner, retreating back into the role of the invisible observer even as the smell of sandalwood and gunpowder filled her lungs. She understood the architecture of his violence because she had lived in its blueprint. Taeho's world was one of casual precision, where a man's name was whispered near exits and a tailored suit was merely a sheath for a sharpened blade. It was a world where loyalty was a currency traded in secret, and where even a childhood friend like Miho could be turned by the right amount of pressure or the specific choreographed lure of a better deal. The scratch on Taeho's cheek from the flying glass was the only crack in his porcelain mask of invincibility. He stood amidst the marble dust, looking at the empty doorway where his life was supposed to have ended, and Naomi saw the gears of the syndicate turning behind his dark eyes. He wasn't just a man. He was an institution of cold, violent necessity. In his world, service staff were less than shadows. Yet here he was, forced to acknowledge that his empire had been compromised by his closest allies and saved by a woman who had spent years smoothing his linens in silence. The shadow he cast was long and jagged, reaching out to claim Naomi not as a servant, but as a witness to the rot at the heart of his kingdom. Taeho's breathing was shallow, a sharp contrast to the predatory stillness he usually projected. He didn't pull away from Naomi. Instead, he seemed to be weighing the impossibility of the moment. His empire was built on the absolute certainty of his inner circle, yet it was a woman who lived in the periphery of his vision who had seen the knife coming. "How?" he asked, the word barely a vibration in the smoke-filled air. Naomi didn't look at the shattered glass or the chaos beginning to swarm outside the estate. Her eyes remained on the doorway where the advisor, the right-hand man, had stood only moments before. "It wasn't the sniper I saw first," she said, her voice steady, stripped of the subservient lilt she had worn like a mask for 3 years. "It was the watch." She explained the language of violence she had mastered long before she ever stepped foot in the Dragonhead mansion. She spoke of her father, a man whose moods were telegraphed by the twitch of a finger or the way he held a glass, and how she had learned that a break in a man's physical rhythm was the loudest warning a person could receive. The advisor was a man of rigid, left-handed habits, a trait Naomi had cataloged in her first week while serving him tea. He did everything with a practiced, left-leaning symmetry that suggested a mind obsessed with order. But when he looked at the courtyard just now, he used his right hand. Naomi continued, her gaze shifting back to Taeho. It wasn't a natural movement. It was a choreographed signal, a confirmation gesture meant for eyes watching from a distance. She described the microscopic flash of red light, the laser sight, that had danced across his platinum cufflinks. In that moment, the advisor wasn't just checking the time. He was confirming the target was in position. The betrayal wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision. It was a performance, and he had flubbed the most basic line. The right-hand man had been so focused on the lethality of the sniper's scope that he forgot the invisible MAID was reading his every micro-expression. Taeho's jaw tightened, the realization of the betrayal finally sinking in. The man he had treated as family had signaled his death, and the woman he had treated as a ghost had caught the error in the script. The stillness in the room grew heavy, a paused explosion, as Taeho realized that his right hand was gone, and the only loyalty he had left was currently gripping his tie. The secondary hit didn't come from a rifle. It came from the throat of the house itself. As the echoes of the first shot died, a rhythmic, bone-deep thrumming began. The sound of the estate's heavy security gates slamming shut, but the sequence was wrong. They weren't locking the world out. They were trapping Taeho inside. Naomi felt the shift in the air before the first scream broke the silence. The right-hand man hadn't just hired a sniper. He had turned the very men Taeho paid to die for him. Movement at 10 o'clock. Naomi hissed, her voice cutting through the ringing in Taeho's ears. She didn't wait for him to lead. She grabbed the lapel of his bespoke jacket and shoved him toward the service corridor hidden behind a floor-to-ceiling tapestry. The glass partition didn't just shatter this time. It disintegrated as a volley of automatic fire raked the foyer. The elegant marble floor, polished to a mirror finish by Naomi's own hands, was suddenly slicked with something darker and thicker than rainwater. One of the junior guards, a boy Taeho had personally recruited from the streets of Seoul, crumpled near the fountain, his white shirt blossoming into a jagged red map of betrayal. The sound was deafening, a relentless, metallic chewing of the architecture. They reached the service door just as the main entrance was breached. The smell of sandalwood was gone, replaced by the choking, metallic tang of blood and spent gunpowder. The kitchen elevator, Naomi commanded, her hand steady even as the walls vibrated with the impact of lead. It's manual. They won't be able to kill the power to it from the security hub. Taeho stumbled, his polished shoes skidding on a fragment of the shattered chandelier. But Naomi caught him with a strength born of years of heavy lifting and hidden resilience. For a man who ruled with absolute stillness, his breathing was now a ragged, desperate sound. He looked at her, his eyes wide and dark, seeing not a maid, but a lifeline in a world that had turned into a slaughterhouse. They plunged into the narrow, dimly lit service stairs. Behind them, the sounds of the estate, the place Naomi had maintained with ghostly precision, transformed into the cacophony of a dying empire. The glass continued to rain down in the foyer, a frantic, shimmering percussion that marked the end of Park Taeho's reign of silence and the beginning of a bloody, desperate flight into the dark. Naomi didn't look back. She only looked for the next shadow, the next signal, the next breath of survival. The manual elevator groaned, a hollow, industrial sound that masked the distant pop of gunfire as they descended into the bowels of the estate. Inside the cramped metal box, the air was thick with the scent of Taeho's expensive sandalwood cologne and the sharp, metallic tang of the blood blooming on his shoulder. He leaned against the vibrating wall, his breath hitching, his eyes locked on Naomi. For the first time, the absolute stillness that defined him was fractured. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the steady hands of a woman who had just dismantled his reality with a single whisper. "They'll have the main roads blocked," Taeho rasped, his voice strained by the sudden weight of his vulnerability. "The safe house in Gangnam. The security detail there reports to Miho." Naomi didn't look up from the control panel. Her gaze was fixed on the shifting shadows visible through the elevator's iron grate. "Gangnam is a graveyard, Mr. Park," she said, her voice devoid of its former servant's lilt. "If Miho signaled that sniper, he's already moved his pieces to every location listed in your official logs. You can't go to a safe house. You have to go where you don't exist." The elevator doors winced open into the damp, concrete reality of the delivery tunnels. Taeho hesitated, the king of a fallen castle suddenly unsure of his footing. He had ruled this city through boardrooms and blood, but he had done so from the back of armored limousines, shielded by men who had just tried to kill him. He knew the city's power structures, but he didn't know its veins. "You saw the signal," Taeho said, a realization dawning in his dark eyes as they moved into the darkness. "Out of 50 trained guards, only you saw it. Because they were looking at you, or looking for the enemy," Naomi replied, her pace quick and silent. "I was looking at the reflection in the glass. I was looking at the way the wind moved the driver's jacket. I see the things people ignore because I've spent my life being one of them." She led him toward a nondescript service van parked in a bay used for laundry pickups. To the syndicate, this was a ghost vehicle beneath their notice. To Naomi, it was the only way out. Taeho followed, his hand pressing against his wound, forced to surrender his life to the servant's eyes that had seen the rot in his empire before he did. As they pulled out into the rainy neon blur of the city, Taeho sat in the shadows of the cargo hold, realizing that his survival no longer depended on his wealth or his name, but on the invisible woman now navigating the back alleys of his kingdom. The laundry van rattled through the rain-slicked back streets of the city, the rhythmic thumping of a loose tire sounding like a heavy, anxious heartbeat. Inside the darkened cargo hold, Park Taeho sat amidst piles of folded linens, his face pale under the flickering amber of passing streetlights. He watched Naomi as she drove, her silhouette steady against the windshield's blur. The silence between them was heavy, a suffocating tension that Taeho finally broke. "The signal," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You said you knew it because of your father. What kind of man was he?" Naomi didn't turn her head. Her eyes remained locked on the road, scanning the side mirrors for the telltale sweep of headlights that stayed too long. "He wasn't a man who wore bespoke suits, Mr. Park," she said, the words coming out cold and precise. "He was a man who worked for people like you, the muscle that gets forgotten when the job is done. He lived in the gaps of the world, and he taught me that in the gaps, silence is the only thing that keeps you alive." She took a sharp turn into a narrow alley, the van tilting. "He taught me to read the language of the hand. He told me that a man's mouth can lie for a lifetime, but his hands will always tell the truth in the second before he acts. When I was 7, I learned to watch his right hand. If it twitched toward his belt, it meant he was reaching for a bottle. If it stayed flat against the table, he was thinking. But if his thumb tucked into his palm, that meant the blow was coming." The memory seemed to sharpen the air in the van. Naomi's grip on the steering wheel tightened, her knuckles white. "Years later, I saw him do that same thumb tuck while he was standing next to a rival's car. He wasn't reaching for a drink. He was signaling a hit. I saw the red dot of a laser sight dance across the chrome of the door handle 3 seconds before the window turned into red mist. He had sold out his own blood for a clean slate." She finally glanced at Taeho in the rearview mirror, her eyes reflecting the neon blue of a passing sign. "Your right-hand man didn't just check his watch, Mr. Park. He tucked his thumb. He made the same fatal error of a man who thinks the person cleaning his floors is too small to notice the shape of his treason. I didn't save you because I'm a hero. I saved you because I've spent my entire life watching the hands of men who think they are invisible until they start to bleed." Taeho looked down at his own hands, resting uselessly in his lap, realizing that the woman driving him wasn't just a witness to his betrayal. She was a graduate of a violence more intimate and more terrifying than any war he had ever waged. The van slowed to a crawl, coming to rest in the shadow of a derelict loading dock 3 blocks from the estate's secondary perimeter. Taeho was weak, the sandalwood scent of his presence now entirely overcome by the sharp, iron smell of blood, but his eyes remained fixed on Naomi with a desperate, newfound clarity. He didn't ask her if she could do it. He simply watched as she pulled a secondary uniform from a hidden compartment beneath the driver's seat. It was the same black and white fabric, the same starched white headband, the ultimate camouflage of the overlooked. "The right hand's quarters are behind the reinforced partition in the east wing," Taeho whispered, his hand trembling as he handed her a small, encrypted keycard he'd kept hidden in his cufflink. "If he's moved against me, he's wiped the central servers. The physical drives in his private safe are the only things that will name the other traitors." Naomi took the card, her expression a mask of chilling neutrality. "Stay in the van. If I'm not back in 15 minutes, drive into the river. Don't let them find you alive." Slipping back into the estate was easier than it should have been. The chaos of the initial hit had settled into a tense, paranoid lockdown. But the internal security teams were focused on the perimeters, looking for an invading force. They weren't looking for the maid who had been polishing the same brass sconces for 3 years. Naomi moved with a rhythmic, invisible grace, carrying a bucket and a cloth as if she were merely reporting for an extra shift to clean the blood from the marble. She reached the east wing, her heart a steady, low thrum against her ribs. The right-hand's quarters smelled of expensive tobacco and the same cold steel that followed Taeho. Inside, the room was a monument to the man's ego, neat, symmetrical, and utterly devoid of warmth. Naomi didn't waste time. She bypassed the obvious desk, moving instead to the heavy mahogany partition that separated the sleeping quarters from the office. She remembered the way the light had hit the wood during her morning dusting 3 weeks ago. There was a microscopic misalignment in the grain, a half-millimeter gap that only someone who spent hours intimate with the furniture would notice. She pressed the encrypted card against the wood. A silent mechanism hissed, and the partition slid back to reveal a hidden terminal. As the drive began to copy files, Naomi heard the heavy click of polished shoes on the hardwood floor outside. It was the rhythmic, left-leaning stride of the right-hand man himself. She didn't panic. She leaned into the shadow of the partition, her breathing becoming a ghost of a sound. She watched through the crack in the wood as the man who had ordered her death entered the room, his thumb tucked into his palm, his eyes scanning the space for the very ghost that was currently stealing his empire from right under his nose. The right-hand man paused in the center of the office, his presence a cold weight that made the air feel thin. Naomi held her breath, her body pressed so tightly against the interior of the hidden partition that she could feel the vibration of the hard drive finishing its cycle. He was close enough that she could smell the expensive tobacco on his suit, the scent of a man who thought he had already won. He reached for a glass of whiskey, his movements precise and arrogant, but then he froze. His eyes had caught the bucket and the damp cloth she had left by the door. In that heartbeat, the predator's instinct flared. He didn't call for guards. He drew a suppressed pistol with his right hand, confirming the betrayal Naomi had witnessed in the reflection of the glass. He moved toward the partition with a silent, lethal grace, but Naomi was no longer there. She had slipped through the narrow gap into the adjacent dressing room, her movements a masterclass in the silence she had practiced for 3 years. She knew the architecture of this room better than the man who slept in it. She knew that the heavy velvet curtains draped over the balcony created a blind spot for anyone standing at the desk. As the right-hand man rounded the partition, his weapon leveled at the shadows, Naomi was already outside, balanced on the narrow stone ledge of the east wing. The rain was a freezing curtain, but she didn't shiver. 20 feet above, on the roof of the garden pavilion, she saw it, the microscopic, rhythmic glint of a lens. The sniper was still in his nest, repositioned to cover the courtyard. He was looking for a fleeing Mafia boss, not a maid clinging to the masonry. Naomi reached into her bucket, pulling out a small, high-intensity industrial flashlight she used for checking the dust in the estate's darker corners. She didn't aim it at the sniper. She aimed it at the glass of the right-hand man's window, just as he stepped into view, searching for her. She pulsed the light once, twice, the exact confirmation rhythm she had memorized from the driver's earlier signal. The response was instantaneous. The sniper, seeing the signal reflected from the trader's own window, adjusted his lead and pulled the trigger. The high-caliber round didn't find Naomi. It tore through the glass and found the man standing behind it. The right-hand man was thrown backward by the impact, his own treachery literally shattering the air around him. Naomi didn't stay to watch him fall. She grabbed the drive, slid down the drainage pipe with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent a lifetime escaping the notice of dangerous men, and vanished into the rainy dark before the sniper even realized he had killed the man who hired him. The purge was not a loud affair. It was a series of quiet subtractions carried out in the dead of night. With the drive Naomi had retrieved, Park Tae-ho didn't need an army. He only needed the truth. One by one, the names on the digital ledger were scrubbed from the syndicate's payroll and the world of the living. The driver, the spotters, and the middlemen who had traded their loyalty for a traitor's promise vanished into the same rainy darkness that had nearly claimed their king. 6 months later, the Dragonhead estate had been rebuilt, the shattered glass replaced with reinforced plating that caught the sun in a cold, impenetrable glint. Inside, the air still smelled of expensive sandalwood and the antiseptic scent of absolute power, but the atmosphere had shifted. The particular electricity of the house was no longer one of impending betrayal, but of a terrifying, watchful silence. Naomi Carter no longer wore the white headband or the black and white uniform. She stood in the East Wing office, dressed in a tailored suit of charcoal silk that moved with her like a second skin. She stood not behind Park Tae-ho, but beside him, her gaze fixed on the glass partition that looked out over the city. She was no longer a ghost in the house. She was the house itself. Tae-ho sat at his mahogany desk, the scar on his cheek a jagged reminder of the night the world broke. He didn't check his phone or look at his watch. He waited until Naomi gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a micro-expression of safety that only he knew how to read. "The new security detail is in place," she said, her voice carrying the same chilling, low-frequency calm that had saved his life. "They think I'm just your advisor. They think I'm someone you met in a boardroom in Seoul. They still don't see me, Mr. Park." Tae-ho looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the neon glow of the skyline. He understood now that his greatest asset wasn't the men with guns or the billions in the bank. It was the woman who knew how to read the tuck of a thumb and the glint of a cufflink. He had traded a right-hand man who wanted his throne for a partner who owned the shadows. "Let them keep looking at the doors," Tae-ho replied, his voice a low vibration of respect. "As long as they don't see you, they'll never see me coming." Naomi turned back to the window, her reflection ghosting over the glass. She was still the invisible observer, the hypervigilant shadow who knew which hand would swing first. But now, she wasn't just watching for the blow. She was the one who decided when it would land. The maid was gone, and in her place sat the silent architect of a new empire, built on the one thing the syndicate had never possessed, a loyalty that was seen but never heard.